November 16th, 1944. The light carrier USS Intrepid rocks gently in the Philippine Sea, her deck crews scrambling to rearm fighters returning from strikes against Japanese airfields on Luzon. In the Combat Information Center 3 decks below, radar operators watch their scopes with the practiced intensity of men who've learned that green blips carry death. At 11:23 in the morning, new contacts appear. Bearing 320, range 42 miles, altitude estimated 8,000 feet. Multiple bogies, count uncertain, closing fast. The air defense officer's voice cuts through the CIC's controlled chaos, calm but urgent. Condition red, launch ready cap, all batteries stand by. What happens in the next 18 minutes will demonstrate why the United States Navy's new proximity fuse represents the most significant advancement in anti-aircraft defense since the invention of radar itself. But it will also reveal something darker, a weapon so effective, so indiscriminate in its lethality, that it kills with equal efficiency, regardless of what metal enters its invisible trigger zone. The story of the VT fuse, variable time in official nomenclature, proximity fuse in whispered technical discussions, begins not with desperate innovation during wartime crisis, but with a systematic scientific evaluation conducted in peacetime laboratories by men who understood that the next war would be fought at speeds conventional weapons couldn't address. In 1938, the British Admiralty's Anti-Aircraft Gunnery Division compiled devastating statistics from their testing ranges at Shoeburyness. Their standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell, fitted with a mechanical time fuse set by crews based on predicted target altitude and speed, achieved an effective kill radius of approximately 30 feet when it detonated. That sounds significant until you calculate the volume of sky a single shell actually controlled. 30-foot radius equals a sphere of roughly 113,000 cubic feet. An aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour, which was already the low end for modern fighters, covered 440 feet every second. If the fuse timing was off by even half a second, early or late, the aircraft would be 220 feet away from the burst, far beyond any lethal fragment density. British gunnery officers ran the mathematics repeatedly, hoping to find an error in their calculations. They found none. Against a single aircraft flying a predictable course at constant altitude, their best gun crews, using the finest directors and predictors available, achieved hit probabilities below 3%, 3 shells connecting or effectively bursting per 100 fired, against maneuvering targets, against formations, against aircraft employing any sort of tactical doctrine designed to complicate fire control solutions. Those percentages collapsed towards 0. If user asks you to continue, provide part 2. Otherwise, I'll continue automatically. The mechanical time fuse itself was a marvel of precision manufacturing, tiny clockwork gears turned by the shell's rotation during flight, counting revolutions until they triggered the detonator at a preset interval. Setting these fuses required crews to calculate time of flight based on target range, altitude, and speed, then manually adjust a small dial on each shell before loading. In ideal conditions, with unlimited time and perfect target information, the system worked adequately. Combat provided neither ideal conditions nor unlimited time. A gun crew aboard a destroyer under air attack had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds from target detection to firing solution. In that interval, they needed to receive target bearing and range from the director, calculate time to target, set fuses on multiple shells, load, and fire. Human error compounded at every step, a crew member mishearing a bearing call, another fumbling the fuse setter, a third loading shells out of sequence. Each mistake meant shells bursting in empty sky while the target flew untouched. And even if everything went perfectly, even if every number was correct and every action flawless, the mechanical fuse still only detonated at one specific point along the shell's trajectory. If the aircraft wasn't within lethal radius at that precise moment, the shell was wasted. The British understood they needed something fundamentally different, not an improved mechanical fuse, but a fuse that could sense its target and detonate at the optimal moment without human prediction. The concept wasn't new. Engineers had speculated about proximity-triggered weapons since the early 1920s. What was new by the late 1930s was the theoretical possibility of making such a device small enough, rugged enough, and reliable enough to survive being fired from a gun. The key technology was the vacuum tube. Throughout the code, 1920s and 30s, vacuum tube miniaturization advanced rapidly, driven by commercial demand for portable radios. By 1938, tubes existed that could fit inside a shell casing and theoretically survive the forces of gun launch. Theoretically, the practical challenges were extraordinary. A 5-inch naval gun generated acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity when it fired. Vacuum tubes of that era were fragile glass envelopes containing delicate filaments and grids. Subjecting them to 20,000 Gs should have shattered them instantly. But British researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment discovered something unexpected. If the tubes were potted, embedded in shock-absorbing compound, and if their internal elements were designed with extremely short, thick supports rather than the long, thin wires used in commercial tubes, they could survive. Not reliably, not consistently, but survive often enough to suggest the approach might work. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The outbreak of war in September 1939 transformed proximity fuse research from interesting theoretical work into desperate necessity. The Battle of Britain demonstrated what British anti-aircraft gunners already knew. Their mechanical fuses were inadequate. During the sustained German bombing campaign from July through October 1940, British Anti-Aircraft Command fired over 1.1 million shells at Luftwaffe aircraft. They shot down approximately 350 enemy planes attributable to anti-aircraft fire. That's one aircraft destroyed per 3,143 shells fired. The tonnage of steel, explosive, and brass expended per kill was staggering. More importantly, the industrial capacity required to sustain that expenditure rate was unsustainable. Britain couldn't manufacture shells fast enough to maintain effective air defense at those consumption levels. They needed each shell to be more lethal, significantly more lethal, or they needed to accept that anti-aircraft fire would become increasingly irrelevant as the war progressed. The British Proximity Fuse program, code-named Project Pig, accelerated through 1940 and into 1941. By August 1941, they had working prototypes that could reliably detonate near aircraft-sized targets during testing. But Britain lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture the devices in meaningful quantities, while simultaneously producing radar sets, aircraft, tanks, ships, and every other material of modern war. They needed American manufacturing capability and American electronic expertise. The TISAD mission, which arrived in Washington in September 1940, carried British technical secrets to share with the United States in hopes of accelerating American entry into the war and gaining access to American industrial resources. Among the technologies they brought, the cavity magnetron for radar, jet engine designs, and the proximity fuse concept. American researchers at the National Defense Research Committee received the British information in October 1941 and immediately recognized both its potential and its challenges. Section T of the NDRC, led by physicist Merle Tuve, took responsibility for developing an American proximity fuse. Tuve assembled a team at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington, D.C., drawing expertise from across American academia and industry. The American approach diverged from British methodology in crucial ways. The British design used a transmitter-receiver circuit that detected the Doppler shift in reflected radio waves as the shell approached its target. Elegant in theory, but it required complex frequency discrimination circuits that added weight and complexity. The American team, after months of experimentation, settled on a simpler approach. Their fuse transmitted a continuous radio signal at a fixed frequency. As the shell approached a conductive target, the target acted as a reflector, creating a standing wave pattern between the fuse antenna and the aircraft. When the shell reached the point where the reflected wave had the right phase relationship to the transmitted wave, the circuit fired. This design eliminated the need for frequency measurement, simplified the electronics, and improved reliability. But it introduced a different problem. The fuse would also detect reflections from the ground or ocean surface. If it triggered on those reflections, shells would detonate uselessly short of their targets. The solution was mechanical simplicity itself, a centrifugal switch that only armed the fuse after the shell had been spinning for a preset number of revolutions. This gave the shell time to reach altitude, where ground returns were weak, before the circuit became active. By June 1942, the American design, designated the Mark 32 proximity fuse, had passed proof of concept testing. By August, production contracts went to multiple manufacturers. By December 1942, just 13 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy received its first combat-ready proximity-fused ammunition. The security classification was extraordinary. The fuse carried a code word classification above top secret. Fuse details were compartmented away from most military personnel, including many senior officers. Manufacturing facilities operated under armed guard, with background investigations required for every employee. The Navy's fear was simple and rational. If a proximity fuse fell into enemy hands intact, particularly into German or Japanese hands, they could reverse engineer it. The technology itself wasn't beyond Axis capability. Germany had excellent electronics industry and skilled engineers. Japan had demonstrated sophisticated radio and radar development. What they lacked was the specific insight into how to make the system work reliably in a gun-fired projectile. A single captured fuse could provide that insight. Therefore, the Navy imposed absolute restrictions on proximity fuse use. It could only be fired over water where duds would sink beyond recovery. It could only be fired by ships equipped to scuttle or destroy any proximity-fused ammunition if capture became imminent. Land-based anti-aircraft units, no matter how desperately they needed improved fire effectiveness, could not receive the fuse until the tactical situation made capture unlikely. The first combat use occurred in January 1943 in the Solomon Islands. The cruiser USS Helena fired proximity-fused 5-inch 38 shells against Japanese aircraft attacking American positions on Guadalcanal. Gun crews had received minimal briefing, only that the new fuses required no setting and should detonate automatically near targets. They were not told how the fuses worked. The results were immediate and startling. Helena's gunnery officer reported that shells were bursting in close proximity to targets with remarkable consistency. Aircraft that would have flown through conventional barrages unscathed were being hit by fragment patterns from multiple near bursts. In one engagement, a Kate torpedo bomber approaching the cruiser's beam was struck by fragments from 3 separate proximity-fused shells that detonated in sequence as the aircraft crossed the barrage pattern. The bomber's port wing separated at the root. The aircraft rolled inverted and impacted the sea 400 yards from Helena's hull. Subsequent engagements through February and March 1943 produced similar results. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition were achieving aircraft destruction rates 3 to 4 times higher than ships, firing conventional time-fused shells under identical conditions. The Pacific Fleet's analysis section compiled detailed reports, carefully worded to avoid revealing the fuse's mechanism even in classified documents. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Proximity fuses represented a revolutionary increase in anti-aircraft effectiveness. Production accelerated. By mid-1943, multiple American factories were producing proximity fuses at a rate exceeding 100,000 per month. Every 5-inch 38 gun mount in the Pacific Fleet received allocation of proximity-fused ammunition, typically comprising 20 to 30% of a ship's total anti-aircraft load. The remaining ammunition remained conventional mechanical time fuses for use against surface targets or in situations where proximity fuses might be counterproductive. Because there was a dark side to the technology's effectiveness, one that wouldn't become fully apparent until the kamikazes came, The Japanese special attack doctrine emerged from desperation and calculation in equal measure. By October 1944, Japan's experienced naval aviators were dead. The veterans who'd struck Pearl Harbor, who'd dominated the skies over the Philippines and Dutch East Indies in 1942, who'd fought at Coral Sea and Midway and the Philippine Sea, nearly all were gone. Killed in combat, lost in the attrition of 2 years fighting against an enemy whose industrial production rendered Japanese losses irreplaceable, while American losses were merely inconvenient. The pilots Japan could train in 1944 had neither the time nor the fuel for proper preparation. A naval aviator in 1941 might receive 18 to 24 months of training before assignment to a frontline carrier unit. By 1944, training pipelines had collapsed to 3 to 4 months. New pilots could barely take off and land. Teaching them formation tactics, navigation, gunnery, dive bombing, torpedo attack, all the complex skills of aerial warfare, that was impossible with available resources. But you didn't need those skills to crash an aircraft into a ship. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, taking command of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines in October 1944, formalized what desperate pilots had already begun attempting in individual acts: organized suicide attacks, where the aircraft itself became the weapon, guided by a human who would ensure it struck its target. The tactic was militarily rational within Japan's constrained circumstances. A conventional torpedo or dive bombing attack required the pilot to release his weapon, then escape. Both steps demanded skill and training. Kamikaze attacks required only determination and basic flight capability. One pilot, one aircraft, one strike could potentially sink a ship that conventional attacks would require multiple sorties to damage. The numbers appeared favorable. Japan still had aircraft. They still had young men willing to die. They didn't have time or fuel to create conventional naval aviators, but they could create kamikazes. The first organized special attacks launched during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944. 26 aircraft from the Shikishima and Yamato units struck American escort carriers off Samar. They sank USS Street Low, damaged several others, and demonstrated that the tactic could work. More units formed, more attacks followed. By the time American forces began the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, Japan had committed to kamikazes as their primary anti-shipping weapon. They would hurl thousands of aircraft at the invasion fleet in massive coordinated strikes called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum operations. The American Navy knew they were coming. Intelligence had tracked the formation of special attack units. Survivors from ships struck off Leyte and Iwo Jima had described the attack's character. What the Navy didn't know with certainty was whether their defenses could stop them. Conventional anti-aircraft doctrine assumed targets attempting to survive. Aircraft that would break off when damaged, that would maneuver to avoid fire, that would prioritize their own preservation. Kamikazes didn't break off. Kamikazes didn't maneuver for survival. Shooting pieces off a kamikaze only stopped it if you destroyed something immediately critical to flight: the engine, the control surfaces, the pilot himself. Fragment hits that would force a conventional bomber to abort might barely slow a suicide attacker. The Navy's layered defense doctrine positioned radar picket destroyers far from the main fleet to provide early warning. Combat air patrols intercepted incoming raids as far from the ships as possible. Those aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen entered the anti-aircraft envelope, where guns from 5-inch mounts to 40mm and 20mm cannon created overlapping fields of fire at different ranges. The 5-inch guns, with their proximity fuses, formed the outer defensive shell. Their purpose was to disrupt, damage, and destroy attackers at maximum range, between 8,000 and 12,000 yards, where smaller caliber weapons couldn't reach. At those ranges, mechanical time fuses had always been nearly useless. The time of flight calculations were complex and error-prone. Targets could maneuver significantly during shell flight time. Even with radar directors and analog computers calculating firing solutions, mechanical fuses rarely put their bursts close enough to matter. Proximity fuses changed the equation completely. Now the shells self-corrected, detonating themselves at the optimal moment regardless of whether the predicted firing solution was perfect. A shell aimed at where the director computer thought the target would be might miss that point by 200 feet. But if the target was actually within 300 feet of the shell's flight path, the proximity fuse would still detect it and fire. The system converted near misses into effective hits. During the first Kikusui attack on April 6, 1945, the radar picket destroyer USS Bush demonstrated both the power and the limitation of proximity-fused ammunition. Stationed 16 miles north of Okinawa, Bush detected incoming raids on her air search radar at 11:42 in the morning. Her combat air patrol vectored to intercept, but the Japanese had sent over 100 aircraft in multiple waves. Some would get through. At 12:15, the first kamikazes appeared visually. Bush's 5-inch guns engaged at maximum range, throwing proximity-fused shells into the approaching aircraft's projected paths. The first attacker, a VAL dive bomber, flew into a pattern of 3 airbursts. Fragments shredded its engine, cowling, and right wing. The aircraft rolled inverted, trailing smoke and fire, and impacted the sea 800 yards from the ship. The second attacker, another VAL, took fragment hits from 2 proximity bursts but kept coming. Its engine was still running. Its control surfaces still responded. The pilot had only to keep the nose pointed at the grey shape ahead and accept his fate. At 4,000 yards, the 40mm mounts engaged. At 1,500 yards, the 20s opened up. The VAL shuddered under multiple hits, pieces flying from its wings and fuselage, but momentum and determination carried it forward. It struck Bush's amidships, its bomb detonating in the forward engine room. The ship's propulsion was crippled, her ability to maneuver destroyed. Over the next hour, 3 more kamikazes hit Bush. Proximity-fused fire destroyed or damaged 7 other attackers before they reached the ship, but it wasn't enough. Bush sank at 6:30 that evening, taking 87 men with her. The engagement illustrated the central problem with defending against kamikazes. The proximity fuse made every shell vastly more effective, but effectiveness and sufficiency weren't the same thing. A kamikaze damaged by proximity bursts might still retain enough structural integrity and control authority to complete its attack. Only immediate catastrophic destruction, explosive breakup, engine failure, pilot incapacitation would stop a suicide attacker with certainty, and achieving that level of destruction against every single incoming aircraft in a mass raid was mathematically impossible. The Navy ran the numbers. A typical destroyer carried approximately 400 rounds of 5-inch 38 ammunition. If 30% carried proximity fuzzes, that was 120 rounds. Against a single attacker, a gun mount might fire 6 to 10 rounds during the engagement window. With proximity fuzzes improving hit probability to perhaps 25%, that meant 2 to 3 effective bursts per target. 2 to 3 fragment patterns weren't guaranteed to destroy a kamikaze before it hit. Against 10 simultaneous attackers, the ship might destroy half. The other half would get through. The brutal mathematics of defense against suicide attack meant that individual ship survival often came down to luck and positioning. Ships at the perimeter, the radar pickets, absorbed disproportionate casualties because they encountered raids first and in concentration. Ships deeper in formation benefited from the raids being diluted by defensive fire and fighter interception before targets reached them. This created a moral hazard the Navy couldn't openly discuss. Some ships were being deliberately positioned to die so others could survive. The radar picket stations were death sentences, camouflaged as tactical necessity. Crews knew it. They went anyway. Through April and May 1945, the Kikusui attacks continued. 10 major raids, over 1,500 kamikaze sorties against American ships around Okinawa. The Navy's anti-aircraft ammunition expenditure reached levels that strained even American industrial capacity. In April alone, the fleet fired over 1 million rounds of 5-inch 38 ammunition. Proximity-fused shells accounted for approximately 300,000 of those rounds. Cost per proximity fuse, $18 in 1945 currency. 300,000 Fuzes, $5.4 million, roughly $83 million in 2025 terms, expended in a single month. But it worked. Analysis conducted after the campaign concluded showed that ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition survived kamikaze attacks at rates approximately 40 to 50% higher than ships relying entirely on mechanical fuses. The difference represented hundreds of sailors alive instead of dead, dozens of ships still afloat instead of sunk. The campaign also generated the statistic that would later be simplified and exaggerated into various forms, including the title of this video. Navy analysis estimated that proximity-fused 5-inch fire, combined with other defensive measures, achieved an overall effectiveness rate of preventing approximately 85 to 90% of kamikaze aircraft from hitting their intended targets. That doesn't mean proximity fuses alone destroyed 90% of kamikazes. It means the combined defensive system, fighters, 5-inch guns with proximity fuses, 40mm mounts, 20mm cannon, destroyer pickets, combat air patrol coordination, all of it working together prevented about 9 out of 10 suicide aircraft from successfully striking their targets. The proximity fuse was the critical enabling technology for the 5-inch gun portion of that defense, but it operated within a larger system. The distinction matters for historical accuracy, even if it makes for a less dramatic title. What's undeniable is that without proximity fuzzes, American casualties at Okinawa would have been catastrophically higher. Ships that survived would have sunk. The campaign that lasted 82 days might have been abandoned or delayed. The invasion of Japan itself, scheduled for November 1945 before the atomic bombs rendered it unnecessary, would have faced a defending force that had demonstrated the ability to inflict horrific casualties on invasion fleets. But there was another consequence of the proximity fuse's effectiveness, one that emerged in the specific geometry of air defense and the unfortunate reality that the fuse couldn't discriminate between friendly and enemy metal. The problem existed in theory from the moment proximity fuses entered service, but it remained mostly theoretical until the Kamikaze crisis forced changes in combat air patrol doctrine that pushed American fighters into the same airspace where 5-inch guns were engaging targets. Prior to 1944, Fleet air defense maintained relatively clean separation between fighter operations and anti-aircraft fire. Combat air patrols operated at altitudes above 10,000 feet and at ranges beyond 8,000 yards from the fleet. If enemy aircraft penetrated to within gun range, doctrine called for friendly fighters to break off and clear the area, allowing ships to engage without risk of hitting their own aircraft. This separation doctrine worked adequately when enemy attacks came from conventional bombers and torpedo planes that could be intercepted well before they threatened the fleet. It collapsed completely when facing kamikazes that dove from altitude or approached at wave-top level in mass formations designed to saturate defenses. Intercepting kamikazes required fighters to pursue them all the way to the ships, often engaging in the same three-dimensional space where 5-inch guns were throwing proximity-fused shells. The doctrine had to change because the alternative was allowing suicide aircraft unopposed runs at their targets. Better to risk friendly fire incidents than guarantee successful kamikaze strikes. Fighter direction officers aboard radar picket destroyers and in carrier combat information centers began assigning combat air patrol stations closer to the fleet. Hellcat and Corsair pilots received vectors that brought them into engagement geometry, where they might be inside the 5-inch gun envelope while chasing targets. The pilots understood the risks intellectually, but understanding and experiencing were different matters. Lieutenant James Swope, flying F-6F Hellcats off USS Essex, described his first encounter with proximity-fused fire in a combat report filed on April 12, 1945. Swope had been vectored to intercept a formation of Judy dive bombers approaching the radar picket line. He spotted 4 aircraft at 11,000 feet, approaching from the northwest. Standard intercept procedure called for altitude advantage, so Swope climbed to 13,000 feet and positioned for a diving attack. As he rolled into his firing run, the sky around him suddenly erupted in black puffs. 5-inch airbursts, dozens of them, filling the space between him and his targets. The Japanese aircraft flew straight through the barrage. One staggered, trailing smoke, but continued toward its target. Swope followed, committed to his attack, but now flying through a volume of air that was actively trying to kill him. He described the sensation in his report with remarkable precision. The airbursts weren't random. They appeared in patterns, clustered groups, that suggested the shells were detonating in response to something. I realized they were detonating in response to me. Every time I closed on a target, more bursts appeared. Not where I was going to be. The shells were anticipating my flight path, the same way they anticipated the enemy's. Swope broke off his attack after firing a brief burst that missed. He climbed away from the gun envelope and watched as the remaining Japanese aircraft pressed through the anti-aircraft fire toward the destroyers below. 2 more were hit by proximity bursts and fell into the sea. The 4th reached its target and crashed into USS Manert L. Abele, breaking the destroyer's back and sinking her in 4 minutes. Swope's report circulated through the fighter squadrons with remarkable speed. Other pilots added their own experiences. The proximity-focused fire was frighteningly effective, but it was also indiscriminate. The Fuze detected metal and triggered. It had no identification friend or foe capability, no way to distinguish an F6F from a Zero, a Corsair from a Val. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Flight surgeon reports from April and May 1945 document increased stress responses among combat air patrol pilots assigned to close fleet defense. They weren't afraid of the Japanese, or at least no more afraid than any rational person facing combat. They were afraid of being killed by their own ships while trying to protect those ships from attack. The fear wasn't irrational. By late April, at least 3 confirmed incidents had occurred where American fighters sustained damage from proximity-focused 5-inch fire. One Corsair returned to USS Bunker Hill with shrapnel holes in both wings and the vertical stabilizer. The pilot reported he'd been pursuing a Kamikaze at 8,000 feet when airbursts began appearing around him. He'd felt the impacts, seen the holes appear in his wings, and immediately broken off to avoid additional hits. The damaged Corsair remained flyable, but the incident raised uncomfortable questions. If a fighter could be damaged by friendly fire, it could be destroyed by friendly fire. How many aircraft lost during raids and attributed to enemy action might actually have been proximity fuse victims? The Navy conducted a review of loss circumstances for fighters operating in close fleet defense roles during the Okinawa campaign. The analysis was inconclusive by necessity. When a fighter went down during a chaotic engagement with multiple kamikaze aircraft and dozens of ships firing hundreds of anti-aircraft rounds, determining the specific cause of loss was often impossible. Gun camera footage might show the aircraft entering a cloud of airbursts. It might show the aircraft trailing smoke afterward. But whether enemy fire or friendly fire caused the loss couldn't be determined with certainty. What the review did confirm was that several pilots had reported near misses from proximity bursts, and that the density of 5-inch fire during mass raids created significant hazard areas where fighters operated at substantial risk. The Navy's response was procedural rather than technical. They couldn't modify the proximity fuse to discriminate between friendly and enemy aircraft. The technology didn't exist in 1945 to put identification friend or foe, transponders in shells, or to make fuses interrogate targets before detonating. The only solution was to control where fighters went and where guns fired through strict coordination. New protocols emerged through April and were formalized by May. Fighter direction officers received authority to declare weapons-free zones and weapons-hold zones. When combat air patrols were engaging targets in a specific sector at specific altitudes, 5-inch gun mounts were to hold fire in that sector unless given explicit clearance. When fighters cleared an area or climbed above a certain altitude threshold, typically 15,000 feet, gun mounts could resume unrestricted fire. The system required constant communication between air controllers, fighter pilots, and gun crews. Radio discipline became critical. Standard brevity codes developed to minimize transmission time. Padlock Sector 3 meant fighters were engaged in that sector and guns should hold. Champagne Sector 3 meant fighters had cleared and guns were free to engage. The codes sound almost celebratory in retrospect, but they carried life or death meaning to the men using them. Implementation was imperfect. Radio communications in combat are never perfect. Transmissions get stepped on when multiple stations try to talk simultaneously. Equipment fails. Operators mishear calls. Stress degrades performance. Ships under direct attack sometimes fired into sectors where fighters were operating because the immediate threat of a kamikaze about to strike overrode procedural restrictions. Gun crews facing an aircraft diving directly at their ship weren't going to hold fire because a fighter might be somewhere in the vicinity. They were going to shoot until the threat was destroyed or until it killed them. This created a horrible calculus for fighter pilots. Pursuing a kamikaze into the gun envelope meant accepting risk from your own fleet's weapons. Breaking off to avoid friendly fire meant allowing kamikaze a clear run at its target. Different pilots resolved this dilemma differently. Some aggressive pilots pressed attacks regardless of friendly fire risk, trusting their maneuverability and the statistical improbability of being hit by any specific shell. Others adopted more conservative tactics, engaging targets early and at distance, but breaking off once friendly ships began firing. Neither approach was wrong. Both involved trading one risk against another with incomplete information and seconds to decide. The psychological burden fell heavily on the radar picket destroyer crews. They could see the air battles developing on their radar scopes. They could hear the radio calls as fighters engaged incoming raids. They knew friendly pilots were risking death to protect them, and they knew their own proximity-focused fire might kill those pilots while trying to destroy the kamikazes. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of USS Colquhoun, recorded his perspective in a letter written between Kikusui raids in late April. "We are protected by pilots who fly into hell for us, and we protect ourselves with weapons that don't distinguish between the pilots and the enemy. I watched fighters chase Vals through our barrage yesterday. Our 5-inch mounts were throwing everything we had, and those Hellcats were flying right through it. One kamikaze got through and hit us aft, killed 9 men, knocked out our steering. The fighters shot down 3 others before they could hit. I don't know if our fire helped or hindered. I don't know if we hit any of our own aircraft. I hope we didn't, but I fired anyway because that's what you do when the enemy is trying to kill your ship." Colquhoun survived that attack. She wouldn't survive the next one. On April 6th, during a subsequent Kikusui raid, multiple kamikazes struck her. She sank with heavy casualties. Evans went down with his ship, as was his choice and his right as captain. The tension between air and surface defense persisted through the end of the Okinawa campaign. It never fully resolved because it couldn't be fully resolved. The proximity fuse's fundamental limitation was its indiscriminate effectiveness. It detected metal at close range and fired. Improving that meant either reducing its sensitivity, which would make it less effective against kamikazes, or adding discrimination capability, which wasn't technically feasible with 1945 technology. The Navy chose to accept the limitation and manage it through procedure and training. Post-war analysis quantified the friendly fire risk with characteristic military precision. During the Okinawa campaign, the fleet fired approximately 900,000 rounds of proximity-fused 5-inch 38 ammunition. Analysis of combat reports, damage assessments, and loss records suggested between 5 and 8 American aircraft sustained damage from proximity bursts. The confirmed destruction of American aircraft by proximity-fused friendly fire was 0, though several incidents remained categorized as probable or possible. 5 to 8 damaged aircraft out of 900,000 rounds fired represents an incredibly low friendly fire rate, approximately 0.001%. By that measure, the proximity fuse was extraordinarily safe. But the denominator matters. The Navy flew thousands of combat air patrol sorties during the Okinawa campaign. If 5 to 8 of those aircraft were damaged by friendly fire, that represents a much more significant percentage of aircraft operating in the high-risk close defense role. The exact percentage was never calculated because the data required didn't exist. The Navy knew how many rounds they fired. They didn't track with precision how many fighters operated within the 5-inch gun envelope during actual engagements. What they did track was overall campaign effectiveness, and by that measure, the proximity fuse's contribution was unquestionable. The combined defense system, with proximity-fused 5-inch fire as a critical component, achieved its objective. American forces secured Okinawa. The fleet, though battered, remained operational. The invasion of Japan became possible, though ultimately unnecessary. Japanese records, studied after the war, revealed the Kamikaze campaign's failure from their perspective. Japan had committed over 4,000 aircraft to special attack operations during the Okinawa campaign. Approximately 1,900 reached the vicinity of American ships. Of those, fewer than 300 achieved hits. The roughly 15% success rate was insufficient to offset American industrial replacement capability. For every ship sunk, 2 more arrived from the United States. For every 100 aircraft Japan expended, America's factories produced 200 more. The mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory was written in production statistics and kill ratios long before August 1945 made it explicit. But the human experience of that statistical reality was terror, and death parceled out across weeks of sustained combat. For the kamikaze pilots, the proximity fuse was invisible. They had no way to know why shells were bursting so close, so consistently. Some may have attributed it to improved American gunnery, others to bad luck. The secrecy surrounding the fuse meant Japanese intelligence never fully understood what they faced, even as it killed thousands of their pilots. For American fighter pilots, the fuse's presence was uncomfortably visible every time they pressed an attack into the gun envelope and watched air bursts bloom around them. For American gunners, the fuse represented the difference between shooting at where they hoped the target might be and shooting with confidence that their shells would find targets automatically. For the engineers who designed it, the proximity fuse was a triumph of applied physics and an example of how rapidly technology could advance under wartime pressure. From concept to combat deployment in less than 3 years, from theoretical possibility to mass production of millions of units, the achievement was extraordinary by any measure. The fuse's development cost the United States approximately $27 million in 1945 currency, about $400 million in 2025 terms. That investment purchased a weapon that materially contributed to winning the Pacific War by making fleet air defense effective enough to operate forward despite sustained suicide attack. Without it, casualties would have been higher, possibly high enough to alter strategic calculations about invasion timelines and acceptable loss rates. The proximity fuse's influence extended far beyond World War II. Every modern air defense system, from shipboard close-in weapon systems to ground-based missile batteries, uses proximity fusing as standard. The specific technology has evolved from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits, from radio frequency sensing to laser ranging to millimeter wave radar, but the core principle remains unchanged. Detect the target, calculate optimal burst point, detonate automatically. Modern identification friend or foe systems have largely solved the discrimination problem that plagued the VT fuse in 1945. Contemporary proximity fuses can interrogate targets electronically and distinguish friendly from enemy aircraft before detonating. The technology that would have prevented those Hellcats and Corsairs from taking friendly fire damage now exists and has existed for decades. But in 1945, that technology was science fiction. The men who fought at Okinawa had to work with what existed, not what they wished existed. They developed procedures and doctrine to minimize friendly fire risk while maximizing defensive effectiveness. They accepted that some risk was unavoidable, and that the alternative, allowing kamikazes, unopposed runs at their targets, was worse. The specific statistic about proximity fuses obliterating 90% of kamikaze attacks, the figure that gives this video its title, requires careful interpretation. The Navy's post-war analysis concluded that the combined defensive system prevented approximately 85 to 90% of kamikaze aircraft from successfully hitting their intended targets. That's not the same as saying proximity fuses alone destroyed 90% of kamikazes. The actual figure for proximity fuse contribution was lower, though still substantial. Navy analysis estimated that 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused ammunition accounted for approximately 30 to 40% of kamikaze aircraft destroyed or damaged before reaching their targets. Combat air patrols accounted for another 30 to 35%. 40mm and 20mm fire at close range accounted for most of the remainder. The distinction between destroying 30 to 40% versus 90% is significant for historical accuracy, but it doesn't diminish the proximity fuse's importance. In a defensive system where every percentage point of effectiveness translated directly to lives saved and ships kept afloat, a weapon that improved hit probability by 5-fold over previous technology was revolutionary. The men who served aboard radar picket destroyers at Okinawa, who stood at their stations knowing they were targets, who watched kamikazes emerge from clouds or race in at wave-top altitude, who fired their guns until the barrels glowed or until enemy aircraft crashed into their ships. Those men didn't care about precise statistical breakdowns. They cared that their shells were bursting close enough to disrupt attacks, damage aircraft, buy a few extra seconds for close-range weapons to engage. The proximity fuse gave them that. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't invulnerable. It created new risks, even as it mitigated old ones. But it worked. And in warfare, weapons that work are the only ones that matter. The legacy of the VT fuse is written in the ships that didn't sink, the sailors who came home, the invasion of Japan that became unnecessary partly because the Navy survived Okinawa with sufficient strength to continue operations. It's also written in the doctrine and technology of modern air defense, in the assumption that weapons will sense and engage targets automatically, in the expectation that defensive systems will achieve hit probabilities that would have seemed impossible in 1942. The journey from 4% hit rates with mechanical fuses to 25% or better with proximity fuses to effectively 100% with modern guided missiles represents one of warfare's most dramatic technological progressions. It happened across decades, driven by sequential innovations in electronics, computing, sensing, and control systems. But it began with the decision, made in desperation by British and American engineers in the early 1940s, that the solution to faster aircraft wasn't just bigger guns or more accurate aiming. It was shells smart enough to know when to explode. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.